So today we are talking about climate responsive design and how that might apply to Nelson. So we have two speakers today. We have Lindsay Wood. Lindsay is a registered architect and about 10 years ago transitioned his business into a climate strategy consultancy in Resilience NZ and does a lot of work in the climate advocacy and policy research development space through Resilience NZ. We also have Jan Heijs. Jan is a retired civil engineer and co-founded the Nelson Tasman 2050 Housing and Urban Development Advocacy Body. So they'll talk about climate responsive design, and there'll be some time for questions at the end. So over to you.
Kia ora, thanks. Tēnā koutou, everybody. Lovely to see you. Thanks for coming out on a Thursday night, a warm, windy night. Not so windy as it has been, is it? So, those of you that know me, if I get it going. Well, I turned the lights off anyway. We might have to have another go at that. Sorry. There we go. I don't. Can you read that? We had a bit of a play with the size of the screen, and that's the best we could do. Sorry?
Thank you very much.
Right. I'm going to go pretty quickly. I've got a lot of ground to cover. I've got a 20-minute warning from William here, and so we'll see how we go. It's probably not going to be quite what you're expecting. And so I'm going to kick off with a couple of quotes from Albert Einstein. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about it, the problem, and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. And then the other side is we can't solve our problems with the same thinking used when we created them. And my thesis is that we've spent far too little time trying to understand the climate problem and far too quick to try and fit what we think is the problem to our old thinking rather than trying to come up with new thinking. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go spend the equivalent of Einstein's 55 minutes. We're going to spend quite a lot of time looking at the climate problem, and then I'm going to spend a relatively short time at the end trying to connect it with possible urban solutions. So I'm going to make a few points at the beginning. The first one is, in the climate sense, there are big changes already baked in. If we stopped all our emissions now, then we'd still have some coming on, but there's a lot more happening, as we'll see about at the moment. So my question is, why aren't we all terrified at what's looming? And to be quite honest, we damn well should be. And so we can't avoid the change. Our challenge really at this point in time is to adapt very rapidly to avert more and more and still allow us to stay in a good place. In fact, to find a good place with all that's coming down the line at us. I'm going to keep going through, there's some other information in there, but I'll skip through it in the interest of time. So, key climate point number 2, we must do things very differently, but politicians balk at it. Good shot, Lindsay. Policymakers really resist the level of change needed, and one of the reasons is that they get filtered information that comes through, starts with science, it goes through editorial panels, it winds up going through, I don't know, secretaries and into the politicians. And the other thing is that they're afraid of citizen backlash. And I've interviewed Mayor Nick Smith, and he said, look, we do all that we really should do, and we'll get an uprising from the people. So my point there is that the answer is that we need to bring us all up to speed on climate, and then we need to say to the council, hey, we've got your back if you go for strong policies. I can't stress that enough. Key climate point number 3, net energy return shapes not just the economy but everything. Now, hands up those that have ever heard of net energy return. 3 or 4 have, and I think I know all of you and know where you've heard about it. I'm not going to go into it, but my point is that our economy and our civilization and how much spare time we have and how much what we do with it is all driven not by money but by the energy that a society can access. What's known as the level of surplus energy left after we obtain energy. I'll talk a little bit more about it. Easy hydro and oil have given us the hugely profligate energy economy that we've been on, but this is the crunch. We'll inevitably have to transition to a much lower energy living. It's a myth to think there's enough energy we can access out there to keep sustaining our society at the level that we're used to. you will be diving in and out a bit of geeky stuff as we go. Fourth climate point, and then we'll get on to some other stuff. Present urban environments are excessive by a huge margin in a climate sense. The way we sprawl out, the way we build, and the way we travel as a result of that are really off-scale high compared with what we have to do. For example, our typical houses are about 10 times the carbon footprint that we really can sustain in terms of, for example, the Paris Agreement. Urban sprawl, we've all heard about greenfields development and how bad they are, but they're hugely inefficient in themselves, and so is the infrastructure and travel that go with them. Here's the point, we're so used to commuting in low occupancy cars, and I think we've become blind to the fact that it's an absolute stupidity from an energy point of view, from a cost point of view, and from an emissions point of view. But that's an opportunity. We could, if we wanted, almost instantly slash our emissions and our roading budget and our health costs just by rapidly changing our driving habits. That's an example of a change that the politicians don't have the stomach to make. So now here's today's climate mahi. I said at the beginning we need some mahi. Wakatu, as the climate leader, I'm going to spend the equivalent of Einstein's 55 minutes on those three, some big issues, some regional issues, and a bit on time, and then we'll have a look at some examples at the end. First of all, I want to acknowledge Tangata Whenua, the 8 iwi of Tito Ihu, and I want to say that at the moment I think it's an embarrassment to us Pākehās that nearly 200 years after they got an agreement for their tenth of the area, they're in the High Court trying to get justice in that. There's a map around the corner I just noticed of the Nelson tenths. On the positive note, some of you will know of Te Puna Pono, Being Good Ancestors, a wonderful document they prepared through huge consultation about 2-3 years ago. Intergenerational strategy. I think the phrase being good ancestors is one that we should all carry with us. Right, I'm just going to give you a quick vision of a possible future Nelson, just one vision. Mokopuna living secure, healthy, and a relatively contented lives. Relatively, I don't think we can expect 100%. Our systems, our civic systems and so on, are well adjusted to evolving social and environmental conditions. Now, things are going to change. We need to have systems that will adjust with them. We've got a cohesive society, better grounded in long-term reality. Richard Sellers, who's here, if you heard him talk a few weeks ago, he was talking about having collective soups and things as a means of cohesive societies. A promising future and prospects with a stabilising climate. That's the nub, isn't it? It's a bit ironic that we're talking on the last day of COP28, isn't it? I would hope biodiversity is recovering globally. I'll just touch quickly on that. And that we're making a positive contribution to global well-being. I think the idea of Nelson being a role model and then being outreach to other parts is actually a very big positive if we can achieve that. And in that note, I want to give a big shout out. Some of you may have heard of Pure Advantage. They've just launched a big campaign called Recloaking Papatūānuku. It's the country's biggest ever green regenerative program. And Lord Nicholas Stern, who some people may know as the father figure of climate economics, was on COP28 saying New Zealand model would be a model for nations across the world. So I want to bear a big thumbs up to Pure Advantage on that. Okay, we're going to go a little bit deeper. The climate crisis is part of an even bigger one. Some of you will have heard of planetary boundaries. The Stockholm Institute, Resilience Institute, is the famous repository of this research. And that little circle at the top is the climate change, in that there are 9 boundaries. The point is that climate change is only one of the ways that we're pushing the limits of the Earth. The green circle in the middle is the limit, going from the middle, is the limit that we're meant to be able to go to. So we've got biosphere problems, we've got land change problems, we've got freshwater problems. And just by comparison, only 14 years ago, it was only a fraction of that. So we're really blowing these problems out the water terribly quickly. I'm just going to give you one example. Biological integrity was another one. There's a picture of the relative size in terms of the mass of vertebrates on the planet at the moment. The left-hand side is domesticated animals, 2/3 of them. We humans, another 30%, and we outnumber the weight of all the other vertebrates, land-based vertebrates on the planet by a factor of 10. If we only go back 100 years, there are actually more wild mammals than there are people. So again, we're pushing that over the limit very quickly. Okay, climate crisis 101, the greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide. I've got a bit of background information, but I want to make a few points. Carbon dioxide is the gas that causes about 2/3 of all the global overheating. 87% of that, where the yellow is, comes from burning fossil fuels. We all know about that. That's all happened in just the last couple of 100 years. 94% of all of Nelson's household emissions comes from fossil fuel transport. So we've got a strong connection between what we're doing and what the climate problem is. I'm not going to spend time talking about those. We can come back to them later if you want. The climate crisis in context, temperature. This is what the CO2 and other things are doing to us. I think that chart shows the last almost 1,000 years, of which nearly all is relatively stable temperature until right at the end it suddenly shot up, and that's the last 100 to 200 years since we started burning fossil fuels. I've got a news cutting at home that was 1912 from the Rodney and Otamatia Times, that famous science journal, that says if we keep burning coal at the rate we've got, the global temperature is going to go up. And so that's where we are at the moment. This is what the IPCC, the United Nations Committee, says we're going to be on track for. Is 2.5 to 2.9 degrees warming. If that red line shows what we've done, and that 2,000 years of stability actually goes back about 10,000 years like that to the last ice age. So again, we're blowing this out of the water. So what's the big deal about 1.5 degree global warming? Well, here's a thing from the IPCC that's saying one of the things is that we risk major tipping points. Okay, if as soon as we get over 1.5 to 2.5 degrees, they become high risk, and above that, very high risk. Here's a table with tipping points are things where some major system gets past a point of no return and often makes things a lot worse. For example, melting tundra in Siberia releases methane, which makes the warming even worse and melts more tundra. If you look at, I don't know, can you see that light there? Okay. If you look at the blue column, that's 1.5 to 2 degrees warming. Look at all these red dots. Each of these corresponds with a major tipping point that's going to be triggered at, the science tells us, at about 1.5 degrees. Nobody can say exactly. This is one thing that we should really get a shiver down our spine over. Sorry, this is, we'll get on to Nelson at some stage. There's a massive deep ocean circulation current. There's a majestic current that goes all around the world. The blue is deep down, the orange is near the surface. The things that drive it are cold water sinking about here off the Antarctic and cold water sinking off the Arctic. And it's a monumental thing. Very recent research shows that this system is collapsing due to the amount of fresh water going in these areas. And it's a bit complicated, but it affects the salt content and salinity of the water as well as the temperature, and it's not going down so fast. To give you an idea of the scale, those currents, if you put every river on the planet together, these currents, even though they only move very slowly, move about 150 times the water of every river on the planet put together, so they're massive. They will affect us all over, and they're happening much quicker. This decline is happening much quicker than people expected. So there are some reasons. Here's the killer equation. I talked about energy before, and it's sometimes termed the killer equation. I'm not going to expect you to take in these energy flow diagrams, but the message is the lower net return on energy, I'll touch base on that, will dramatically constrain major aspects of our lives. And for those that can handle this sort of thing or are interested, if you imagine the blue is the total mass of energy coming into the society, we have to siphon a bit off the lilac to get more energy, whether it's collecting firewood or drilling an oil well or making a photovoltaic panel. But as we go on, we find that we've picked the low-hanging fruit and we need more and more energy to get energy. And what's left after we do that is a combination of the orange that we need for essential services and the green, that's the surplus that lets us have a bit of a lifestyle, climb Mount Everest or have lots of bottles of nice wine or whatever. And as we need more purple progressively, we have less and less lifestyle, eventually less and less essential services. So we're on a very uncomfortable energy trajectory. And here's a bit of how, you don't have to take any of these in. A guy called Simon Michaud has analysed all the power that we need in all the power stations. He's analysed what we need in the future to decarbonise all the coal power stations and everything. He's analysed how much metal reserves we've got in the whole world. And he's analysed how much we can produce in the way of stuff. And there's a link to it. But here's the summary of it. They're impossibility equations for energy and for minerals. Energy, even if we could open a new power station every half hour forever, which is what his calculations show, that's around the world, the equality of the energy will still struggle to sustain our society the way we're used to. And if you look at minerals, even if we could find enough minerals to do all that building, our mining capacity is orders of magnitude too small, and we can't upscale it quickly enough. So either way, we're stranded on both energy and the stuff we need to build energy systems. And here's a little bit from the IPCC. Earlier this year, they brought out an important report, and it showed a whole lot of pathways. And these pathways, I should stress that the worst is at the bottom. So if we start, we're here, the dotted one at the top are pathways we're actually too late for. We've already, the whole vertical line is the stuff that is where we are, so we've lost the chance for the best outcomes. That circle goes around the pathways to about 1.5 degrees. They're not poor, they're worse climate effects than we've been experiencing, Cyclone Gabrielle and the terrible fires in the Northern Hemisphere. But the bottom lot, the United Nations currently describes as between hellish and catastrophic. And that's the setting that we're on at the moment in terms of the emissions we're producing. Oh, sorry about that again. Now, if we get on with very strong action, such as doing the right things in Nelson, we've got a chance to land in a reasonable place. Okay, this is getting local now, not global. It looks global. About 5 years ago, I gave a paper at a big climate conference in Berlin, and I opened it by saying, there's a 2,000 kilometer radius circle around Berlin where we were, and you can see it captures Moscow and it captures Madrid. And I said, well, now if we go to Nelson, we put a 2,000 kilometer circle around Nelson, and it doesn't even reach Sydney. So they've got over 100 times the people, massive difference. And that's where we are at the very end of a very long supply chain. Economically, we've got some big problems. Not telling you anything you don't really know. The fisheries are already suffering. King Salmon will be able to tell you about that. Forestry, we know about that. Tourism is a discretionary dollar, the energy thing that's going to squeeze the discretionary dollar. So even if we could generate the energy, it wouldn't sustain us well enough. Agriculture and horticulture, they're already planting different grapes at different altitudes in Marlborough because of the change. Here are some other interesting regional features. We're closing in on us now. Small but very different councils with large logistic loads. I think we ask too much of our councils, or the government does. They're very anxious about a public backlash. I've talked about that. Here's our situation. We're globally extreme users of private vehicles, as we talked about a minute ago. We've got limited energy and transport links to the rest of the country, and a major potential impact from an alpine fault failure. All good news, isn't it? Right, here we go. So that's the sort of location stuff. I want to talk a little bit about time. Climate action, too soon, still too soon. Oh, I don't know what's happening there, but now we're too late. That's a classic problem. It's often associated with what's known as the exponential function. I won't drag you into that. But how are we doing? The Carbon Tracker has just released, which is a major organisation in this area, just released a map of how all the countries are doing in terms of their Paris pledges. Green is you're doing okay, and there's not a single green one on the planet. So New Zealand is down at highly insufficient. We're worse than Australia now. Everyone is failing to give even a 50% chance. I didn't mention that, but the Paris targets are not to guarantee we're going to get somewhere, to give us better than a 50% chance of getting there. Imagine being in a plane and the pilots say, I think we've got better than a 50% chance of landing. The world nobody's getting it right. We really desperately need models. So I'm saying Nelson's a wonderful place for that. Actually, we're a good size, we've got a switched on citizenship, and we've got a lot at risk. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of what we should be looking at. What reduce emissions 43% by 2030 means, that's the IPCC figure. This is what we have to do in Nelson to be on track for that best we can do by 1.5 degree maximum warming. And that is reduce our emissions 8% roughly every year, year on year. It only says to 2030 there because that's the figure that the IPCC pitches. In 2020 and COVID, all of that shut down, our emissions went down depending on where you are, you talk to 4 to 7%. Our new e-bus system, wonderful e-bus system, has taken approaching 2% of our emissions. So, just to frame it quickly, there's the 8.5% growth, that's now. Had we started when, for example, Nelson declared a climate emergency, that would have only been 5.2%. It gets worse the longer we leave it. If we leave it 2 more years, it goes from 8% up to 11% and carries on up. So it's nearly all happening faster than expected, and I won't explain that to you because we're running tight on time now. Okay, think differently and imagine a family-friendly city. This is all motherhood and apple pie stuff, but generous open space and green corridors, busy shops and amenities, shade, water and breezeways for coolness, the ability to live well without a car, the noise of people, not cars, frequent free public transport, and Nelson-style climate-friendly buildings. Again, Richard spoke about having a Nelson-style building. Okay, here are a few examples. Think differently. Transport, a win-win-win at the Queen Street State Highway 6 intersection. Some of you may be aware of this. There's the intersection. It's notorious for traffic jams, for fumes, for problems for people on bikes and push wheelchairs and so on. And here's roughly what's being proposed. That's not image, that's actually the overpass at the bottom of Colombo Street in Christchurch. So that's what's being talked about there. Wouldn't that be wonderful, a hover ring? So the idea is take the active transport, the bikes and the pedestrians and the wheelchairs, up on this gorgeous thing above it. All the traffic works on a roundabout like they do at Annesbrook and so on. It's better for the vehicles, it's better for the people, and it's a stunning entrance to Richmond instead of a bloody concrete bridge, excuse me. So commercial vehicles flow smoothly, reduced emissions, great for active transport, far fewer low occupancy cars. Circle around that. That is one of the keys. Get people, the low occupancy cars, to carry more people. Thinking differently. Key amenities within a 15-minute walk. Some of you will know of the Quarter Hour Paradise. It's a great Kiwi organisation, a great website, where there's a Karori before and Karori afterwards. The 15-minute city is not a new concept, but it's a very, very relevant concept to be able to define what we can do around areas. Intensification is an important part of that. Okay, most car parking is given over to greenery because we don't need it because not so many cars coming in. New development only by an urban intensification, that's important. We can live well without a car. There's the Nelson style of buildings. I won't go into it more at the moment because we're right on full time. Thinking differently about public transport. Some may have heard of Enrique Penalosa, who that's a wonderful phrase. Advanced cities are not where the poor drive cars, but where the wealthy ride in buses. What say all our new blue buses had a bylaw that said, you've got to give way to a bus. Big sign when they're pulling out from a stop or turning. It changes the status of the buses and it changes the attractiveness of riding on them. There's some more ideas, we won't go into those. More things we could talk about. So, what's our understanding of the problem? We should be terrified enough to demand action. We must find ways to speedily educate ourselves on climate. Educate ourselves and participate in decision making is a very big thing because the politicians won't get there by themselves. If we're lucky, we'll then still be able to get to a good place. If we do it soon, we can then show the world how to do it, and hopefully that will be part of a ripple and a pond effect. And the physics and logistics of energy will force our hand anyway, so why don't we get on and do it in as well managed a way as we can? So we need to think differently about the problem. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Oh, right. Sorry it was rushed. It was already condensed a lot.
I'm assuming the mayor and the entire council is here. Not a single one.
We'll take a few bits.
So at the end.
Okay.
Let's hope they find time to look at the report. Let's hope they find time to look at the report.
Can you put mine on?
It's there. It should go when you click that one will blanket and that one will start off.
Right. Thank you. Right, yeah, my name is Jan Heijs. Been in water management for 50 years almost. In the Netherlands first, and then since '98 in New Zealand, particularly in the space of stormwater and wastewater management, strategic planning. So I'm here to talk about sponge cities and what we can do to avoid the negative effects and how to use water as a resource instead of a waste. So what did we do wrong and still are doing wrong? So we're building in floodplains all the time. We're building in old swamp areas. This is a picture of Wairau Valley in North Shore. I was the planning manager in North Shore before 2010. We actually modeled this, that this was going to happen. Nobody believed us because they said, no, it's never flooded here. If we'd ever had a big event, it would be sweet. It was totally swamped in January, and now they're asking why. It's just, we're making urban areas a hard shell and removing green spaces. So I was involved in projects in North Shore. At some point we got a peer reviewer in for some of the work we did. He came from Denmark. And he said, you're like a turtle shell. It's just amazing the amount of green space you've basically got rid of. This is a picture of the inner city of Nelson. And there's nothing green, there's nothing spongy, I suppose. And you need trees, you need green space, and this way you're going to stand when it rains under a tree. And then the other thing is we're removing and piping and channeling streams. Just imagine you've got a big, nice stream like the brook. And then you put a pipe in it or you channel it. Guess what? Those pipes are now typically in New Zealand designed for 1 in 100 year storms, but those channels took way more. So you're basically asking for a flooding event. Engineers like me trying to tell you, no, it will be sweet, it's designed for 1 in 100. What happens is when it's 1 in 100 years, 101 years? What happens if climate change, when 1 in 100 becomes 1 in 10? And I think so we've kind of designed to fail, really. So it's very complex, but the only thing I want to show is this is the normal runoff. This is hours and this is velocity. So normally runoff would look like that, and if you develop, it can look like that or like that, depending on whether you put it in retention or not. So you hugely increase volumes when you start compacting and putting impervious areas on and so on. So if you don't mitigate it, that's what's happening. There's another slide which I find really important. This shows the catchment imperviousness, so how much of the area is hard shell, and the stream health. So even if you're like 20-30% impervious, your stream quality normally deteriorates quite significantly if we don't do mitigation. So the effects we've seen, these are a few Nelson pictures. We're talking about floodplains, but also overland flow, water running down the hill. It's amazing that in Nelson they haven't even mapped overland flow, although that's quite a cheap process that I've been involved in elsewhere. And there's no maps, there's no overland flow maps. Richmond's done it, Tasman has done it, but Nelson doesn't seem to be worried about it. So it causes damage to people and property and landslips. And there's cost, direct cost, damage, but also indirect. Your rates go up, your insurance premiums go up. Then obviously streams erode as you push more water through them. These are quite some dramatic pictures, but they're real. And you've got other effects. The urban heating is interesting. This is just a little picture I found. Like on a sunny day, the tar seal is about 44 degrees. The grass berm is 25, and under the shrubs it's only 19. So we can see what it causes from an urban heating point of view. And why are we avoiding runoff getting into landscaped areas? If you look at, these are a few streetscape pictures from Nelson. Every green space basically has curbs on the other side. Water can't even get into it, and you have to water them or the plants get too dry. Why is water not just running in those landscaped areas? Roading engineers surely have a reason for that, but it's the wrong reason. So what is this sponge? It seems to be kind of a bit of a modern term these days. There's other terms around. Water sensitive design is mostly used in this area, low impact design in America, sustainable urban drainage systems in England, and molded regolden in Germany, and there's probably heaps more, but it's all the same thing, much of the same. One of the things is bioretention, rain gardens, and there's lots of types of rain gardens. They soak up water, so you got the normal rain garden, you got bioretention swales, planters, tree pits, green roofs, all sorts of ways to do that. Actually, a process started in the 80s, 90s. I know this Auckland Regional Council had a urban or low impact design guideline in the 80s, 86, I think, but it's still not happening a lot. There's two things that bioretention does. It mitigates hydrology, so slows down the water, so it doesn't cause flooding, both volume and peak flows, and quality. It just treats a lot. 50 to 90% plus is just quite common in those features. And the streetscape, the biggest owner of impervious area is actually the council, all the roads, all the hard surfaces of our roads. So the streetscape is the opportunity to actually address that if you do it properly. And then there's an extra step. I just talk about sponge cities from a water management point of view, but if you think about outside the box, and we're talking here, what if Nelson, how Nelson should look like, I think greening is probably a better term, which includes sponge cities, but it does a lot more. It has all sorts of benefits. It filters, it cools the area, it actually reduces your rates. Believe it or not, it's protecting biodiversity, it's reducing obesity levels because people are more active, it's managing stormwater, and so forth. So there's a whole lot of advantages. I'm happy to make the slides available, but there's heaps of good things about greening cities. But unfortunately, not much is happening. In 2016, there was a low impact design assessment done by Landcare and Morpham, and I was the Morpham dude. And it sits on the website, Nelson and Tasman. There's a whole heaps of recommendations that just sit on the shelf. I don't think anything has been done, almost nothing. There is a new land development manual. That's probably the only little thing that's been done. There's some water sensitive design requirements in there, but it's not supported by the plan, by the district plan or the Nelson regional plan. So they can't enforce it. It's not happening. And that's the reason the uptake is really, really low. There are some practice notes also how to do stuff. There's for bioretention and wetlands, and they've been developed also partly by me. So there's other ways of doing it. Just as a few slides of the Seattle Green Factor. It's been around for I think about 20 years. This is a very simple, just one little calculation. You see that at the bottom right. And it forces people as a planning requirement, if you develop, you have to create green space, either green roof or vertical wall or landscaped areas, and it's extremely successful. There's actually a recent report by the Helen Clark Foundation and WSP about sponge cities, only 4 months old, which is probably worth reading if you want to know more about this. So now some sponge examples, just to sort of trigger a little bit of imagination how that all could look like. There's actually a few in Nelson. So top left is next to NMIT, so the water runs off to the parking and into those landscaped areas. That's the aquatic center. That's Main Road Stroke, quite a big retirement villages, and that's Sanctuary Drive and stuff. So there's a few examples, but already I think about 10 years plus old, and since then nothing happened. You would expect it to take off, but it basically stopped. This is a social housing development near Seattle that I visited in 2008. All the stormwater, so you see rain gardens or swales down the left. You see that rain pipes or rain downpipes don't end up in a pipe system, but just on the surface. There's permeable paving. Social housing, cheap. Doesn't look like that, simply because the whole landscape design, the interface between the streets and the front yards is seamless. No big fences, and it looks beautiful. I wouldn't mind living there at all. All the stormwater is treated, 100% of it. This was a shopping area in Portland, where basically all the runoff from the car park is filtered through those swales. And yes, green roofs. This looks quite cute. But these are real pictures of some of them I've made myself. Again, if you look at the Nelson theme, the most sunniest place in New Zealand, I think we could easily do this and make it into a theme. It also applies in high density areas. People think, yeah, you need lots of garden, lots of space. These are some examples where it's done in very high density. I was involved in the district court building in North Shore at the time. The few landscape gardens that were there could have easily been used to treat all the stormwater. So you don't need a huge amount of space if it's properly designed. There's also some before and after pictures. So the top one, I believe, is Seoul, where it was very car dominant. Could be coming back a little bit about what Lindsay was talking about. So have huge concrete surfaces, lots of cars, and then basically turn it into basically daylighting the stream. Still have some space for cars. I know of a similar exercise in San Francisco, where they took all these big motorways out, and the congestion actually didn't increase. It's just some between some people's heads. This is actually from my home country, Utrecht. They basically basically made a road where there was a channel before, and then they put it back a couple of years ago, and this is what it is. Congestion hasn't increased. There's a really cool website called Biophilic Design. So if you want to kind of get a bit of creative, I think there's so many examples where you can actually get green space into your urban environment and be much better than all this asphalt and concrete surfaces. And would do a lot for stormwater, would do a lot for your physical and mental health as well. Bit of urban greening examples that I've come across, and really the sky is the limit from what I can see. Some of them are designed, some of them are real. And again here, these are real examples, and again it shows that putting green into your city is very, very achievable. And creating a bit of space for children as well. And normally we think flat, but in that Seattle Green Code, they also allow for some vertical walls. And this is the largest vertical garden in the world, apparently. It's in Singapore. So, was it? Yeah. And that's me. Short and sharp.
Right. Lindsay, do you want to jump up and we
Come in
can
the firing line.
take questions? Anyone with questions?
I gobsmacked everybody.
I'm depressed now.
Well,
Do you think cars days are a short-term option for people to wrap their heads around living with less, consuming less?
I think they are. I think there's a whole suite of things like that we can do that basically mean that for some reason somebody doesn't drive on their own in a car. my main thrust there was that all the people sitting on their own, and next time you're there, don't do it while you're driving, but count the number of single occupancy cars, and you think, and that's a big thing. And Carless days, I mean, I don't know whether you're old enough to remember them, but I am. And of course, when there was an oil crisis, if you had an odd number plate, you could drive on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, etc. And of course, the traffic dropped off. But another example of that, in a way, is school holidays. When the school holidays are here, the congestion almost vanishes. I did a study a few years ago for Nelson and Tasman on what would be the impact of car sharing. And it was roughly, if we took 13% of the people and got them to share a car, the congestion would pretty well disappear. And so, I mean, I won't talk more about that, but yes, and other things like 4-day weeks. I think the 4-day week is a terrific phenomenon in that area, as well as people getting long weekends and all the rest of it.
And car sharing schemes, I don't know, in Nelson, is that a thing?
No, the Nelson Council and Tasman Council did subscribe to a national car share app development, but I don't think it ever got off the ground. And car share schemes, that when I reported to the councils, I had a trip going to Europe and they asked me to look at car share schemes. And I found a few, but I didn't find any that were really working well. And I suspect that the Lime scooter autonomous car thing might supplant that rather than car sharing. But if we had enough of a leverage up people's backs, I think they'd find a way. And I had an article in the paper a few months ago, basically saying that when people were moaning about the price of fuel, and I said it's not dear enough yet. When it's dear enough that the pain of the fuel price exceeds the pain of asking to someone ride with you, then you've got a behaviour change. And so, you know, and it's a single occupancy car that sets the size of the roads and all the money, and then the bypass is more about catering for single occupancy cars than it is about trucks or anything. Thank you for that. Nathan.
I'll throw a curve on it, yeah. Matt, how do we deal with the effects of unintended consequences? Like, an example of that, you were talking about the green roofs as a solution to deal with water, but the carbon associated with building a green roof is significantly higher. So, you know, we tend to look at these things as individual solutions for a greater problem. And by doing one thing, we inadvertently create another problem somewhere else.
I totally agree that a lot of stormwater solutions, transport solutions are typically invented with a silo mind point of view. You put water in pipes because it's easy. And we think it's cheap, it's not, but you know. Yes, green roof will have a carbon footprint, I guess. But if we intensify and we build buildings to kind of deliver on that intensification, you can create a win-win situation by also putting a green roof on whatever you're going to build. You know, so in its own right, yes, there's a carbon footprint, but if you look at the win-win and compare it to, say, for instance, sprawl, I think the footprint is way smaller than it would be when you didn't do that.
Can I translate that a little bit into a bigger picture? I talked about citizen participation and decision making. And I think Nathan's point is exactly valid. We often try and do one thing, we make it better, and then something else happens. I remember I had a client who wanted environmental paint. It was years and years ago, and the painter, it was so thin that the painter had to do 8 trips to get it to cover properly. So you think, where's the carbon benefit in that? But anyway, if we have a really effective sort of citizen participation in decisions, I'm talking of big policy things, Plan Change 29 is a great example, climate strategy is another, then I think there's a chance to assimilate an awful lot of expertise about the consequences and the implications. And so in a big picture, I'm a great fan of breaking out of voting every 3 years and just letting them pretend they're consulting and doing something more meaningful. I won't elaborate on it, there's quite a lot to that, but there's good information out there if anyone wants. Thanks. Can I ask a question of you?
Is that right?
We'll have a little chat here, shall we? I love the idea of the breaks in the curbs so the water drains into the gardens. Once it's there, it still has to go somewhere. I mean, maybe not so much, but do you have subsoil drainage or something in those gardens to see what happens to it then?
So typically what happens when it's an oval or along a road, the water obviously falls on to the garden. There is some storage here to get some water that can pond under a heavy storm. Then it infiltrates into the media. It's specifically designed, if you look at those bioretention guidelines, it actually specifies what type of soil, organic matter and all that sort of stuff. And then it comes into a more coarse area, and there will be drainage in here typically. If the ground isn't very gravelly, it can't soak away, there will be drainage in there that's connected, and it eventually comes out in wherever it can be discharged. Now typically the volume loss here is between 50 and 90%. I've actually been involved in some scientific research in Auckland. We built and monitored a few rain gardens, and it's amazing how much water basically gets lost in terms of wetting and drying and evaporation and uptake of plants and everything. And then on top of that, depending on the type of pollutant, there's also like nutrients, obviously suspended solids. There's also a huge effect of reducing pollutants through those media. There were a few that when I was in Seattle, they monitored one rain garden. It's called C Street. You probably can look it up. And everybody thinks that the soil will clog over time and will become kind of impervious. The contrary is true, because of all that biomass doing its thing, worms and everything. It keeps turning over and it's fully functional after 10, 20, 30 years. It's amazing. Maybe you have to scrape up the top 5 centimeters at some point, but not really.
And it soak up soil carbon too, I'm hoping.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
obviously, I mean, these systems are around, certainly in Germany and the US for like 20, 30 years. There'll be lots of research there that in probably ways of improving the carbon uptake, I guess. Learned a lot.
If you take examples of places where this kind of infrastructure change has happened in the past, like for example, taking a motorway pathway and re-greening it in the middle and reducing the amount of total traffic on it, what do you see when you look at what the necessary ingredients to make that community validate that as a good thing to do before that change was ever made? Because that's tearing up vast swathes of concrete, rebuilding a whole pile of stuff. People frequently back away from that magnitude of change because, hey, we can't do this unless we're sure that this is a good idea.
Yeah.
How did those communities actually engage?
It's actually
in
a really good question. I probably should have put it in my presentation. So a good example is Richmond. They have a swale or a bioretention device somewhere, and people had no idea what it was. They didn't like the plants. Some people filled it in. I've seen it in America as well. So it's really important to talk to your community, ideally to involve them in the design and let them pick the plants. And I mean, there's obviously certain things conditions they have to meet, but there's a lot of choice. It has to be nice. And that C Street example in Seattle, actually they got the community involved from day one, and actually the community comes out and maintains the rain garden for the council free of cost because they love it. So the connection from the community to those devices is really important, because there's one thing, and certainly the transport people and councils in general push back because they think it will cost a lot of maintenance. Well, yes and no. There's a study from Melbourne, probably already 10 plus years old, where it says, oh yeah, you have to maintain it like every other landscape area. If you don't maintain the landscape area, it's gonna overgrow with weeds, and you won't like it after a while. So you have to maintain it. There will be an operational cost to do that, but it's not much more than a normal landscape area. Does that answer your question?
Semi.
To add to
The reason I'm still thinking about it is mainly because I'm trying to imagine the process in terms of getting people on board before it starts.
Yep.
And I'm also thinking of it in terms of imagining it as how do you get from A to Z, somewhere in the middle if you've got a situation where you had a corridor that was originally X lanes of motorway, and you decide that you're going to replace the central area of it with trams or with water-based transport or anything else, in the middle stages you would have a situation where you've torn up the original one, you'd have a fraction of the original capacity of transport, and the new system, whatever it is, would not have had time to actually be created yet. So the intermediate space would have been a place of considerable pain as far as the community is concerned, because while you're in the process of changing over from one to the other, the middle bit is going to be completely unworkable. So somebody has to be really seriously committed to saying this is a good idea before you do it.
And
Otherwise it won't happen.
and in New Zealand we struggle with that. I'm not sure who's been involved in the Streets for People initiatives here in the area. The pushback is humongous, either by misinformation or just conspiracy or whatever. But there is an intermediate space that people have no idea what's going to happen. It looks different, and everybody's got up in arms. And so I think the only thing what I can say is just get your community involved from day one. But also it needs leadership. It needs people that can explain what's happening, what the outcome is. And at some point you will never get consensus on these type of issues. At some point you just have to get on with it, like with climate change. You just have to get on with it.
Yeah. Including what some of the middle ground bits might look like, so people are prepared.
Yeah. What they did very well in that, that's why I put this one on, they actually had lots of interpreted signage. So to get the people on board, they actually put a lot of effort into explain what the hell was happening and what it was for. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're talking about people changing people's incentives. You can warn us all you want, but it's very hard for people to change. And a lot of this is rule-based. The rules of the road are very clearly defined. We drive on a certain side of the road at certain speed limits. How involved are the incentives in government, or how involved do you think government should be in this?
In the changes.
Yeah.
If I can go in a little bit to the Citizens Assembly, the participation process.
Sure.
There's just been a big review of local government in New Zealand, and in June they came out with a report, I think, The Future of Local Government or something, and one of the recommendations was that local government trial participatory democracy. That's what that process is. Because there was a very widespread recognition that the normal process of developing a draft plan and then consulting on it was very flawed, because by that stage, if you said anything more than can you just shift that post half a metre, they'd say, oh, that's too hard and we're too far down the track, or we can't get it ready by the deadline. So there's already an incentive there. I don't know about the funding basis of it. It has to be carefully applied. You can't put every decision. The Citizens' Assemblies are groups of, in Ireland they have a group of 99 people. They have a standing one now. They've used it for really contentious things, their climate policy, their abortion legislation, and a few other things. And it's a bit of a well-known example. But I think the point is there that it's not like people put up, can I be on the group? It's selected at random, right across the demographic, so it's very representative. They have specialists speak to, they can ask for somebody else to come, they facilitate a discussion. So it's a very high level of information sharing. And one of the things that comes out is people often say, gosh, I've changed my mind having heard all of that, or I might not have changed it, but I really understand where the other people are coming from or something. So I think in terms of your government buy-in process, I wouldn't say it's a total, let's get on and fund it all, and we've had a change of government since then, so it may be different. But at least there is a recommendation that this is a process we should try. I know the mayor here doesn't like it. He likes the idea that people vote in and then the politicians get on and make their decisions. We could debate about that, but that's, yeah.
I was involved in a proposal to apply a citizens jury for a project in North Shore. And for the same reason, the politicians turned it down because they were too afraid there was an outcome they didn't like.
Yeah.
So they turned it down. Another thing in terms of change behaviour, obviously finance is a big one always, but it has to be substantial. So I was involved in a proposal to fund stormwater through an impervious area charge, because most of the cost of stormwater management are related to the amount of impervious areas. So we call it concrete tax. So in Germany, I visited a place before I immigrated in Germany. It's like 30 years ago, and they charged for impervious area, and they recycled the money back by subsidizing people putting in green roofs and rain gardens on their properties. And I think the subsidy back then was about $10 to $15 per square meter. They did that to avoid a huge investment in upgrading the streams or channels to get rid of the runoff. It was so extremely successful, and they assumed they would have a 20% uptake. And when I was there 2 or 3 years after it started, they had like a 90% uptake. But the tax was substantial, the annual tax, and the subsidy was substantial as well. So it was not like fiddling in the margin. It would really hit you hard if you didn't do anything. But the uptake was amazing. It's really phenomenal. So you can do carbon tax could play a similar role, definitely.
In Hamburg in Germany, they've got, for certain projects, they will pay you to use timber rather than concrete. And it's almost as much as we would pay for timber in New Zealand. I think at that stage it was €70 a metre for our 4x2, which translated to about $1.50 a metre. That's a serious incentive to use timber, but another example.
I think both of you have mentioned, I've got my hearing aid, so I haven't heard everything that's going on. I'm really sorry if I'm repeating this, but one of the things that's been mentioned is that the politicians fear to take action because of the fear of citizen backlash. But on the other hand, they will take action if there's citizen support. So I think one of the things we have to do is work out how to give citizen support. And since I've been in Nelson, I've been involved with 2 petitions, and each of them has resulted in a positive action from the council. One was getting lights on the railway reserve, and the other, we had to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to collect signatures from people going to work in the middle of winter. But we did it, and it worked. I mean, maybe there were I'm sure there were other factors as well, but that's one thing. And the other thing we did was ask people in the Richmond shopping mall if they wanted a bus from Wakefield to Nelson, and we collected 1,000 signatures, which I thought was pathetic, but it was really effective. You know, we did actually get buses eventually. There was a few steps in between, but petitions seem to work because they're a sign, they're a signal of citizen support for really good actions. And without those, then they're going to be afraid to do anything. I don't know if that's helpful, but
I kind of reminds me of. I actually found in water management it was harder to convince the development community and the planners in particular, and the roading engineers than it was the councillors. The councillors, you can tell a story. You can hand in a petition. You can say, do you want to rubbish the next stream or do you want to do water sensitive design? Because that was my case a long way. I said, do you want that sponge city idea? Or do you want the old-fashioned way? You've seen what happened to all the other streams. I said, yeah, go for it. I took the developer to the Environment Court, North Shore City Council. We won. Cost a couple of $1 million on international advice and stuff like that. But we did win. If there's leadership, and the council backed us, but it was normally the planners, Auckland Transport. They were just the biggest asses, really. Am I offending anyone?
I think also, good on you, Pam, and I know about the instances, I think they're great successes. I think there's a difference in scale between lights on the reserve and Plan Change 29, or saying in 2 years' time, we're not going to allow single-use cars coming into town. It's like a quantum leap of impact, and also dealing with a lot more contention. And that's why I'm thinking that I mean, if government or councils were doing their bit, and that comes back to your point a bit, I think they'd be saying, my God, we've got to learn about this climate stuff. We've got to get the citizens on board so that we don't get a big backlash when we do the things we've got to do. But instead, it's sort of, this is all. We'd much rather it went away, or we said we were doing stuff, but we're not. So I don't think it will come from councils. I think there almost needs to be an upwelling maiden petition, but some system of serious public education. But in the end, the citizens' assembly type process, somewhere you're going to need a level of buy-in to that. It's the frameworks for it there out of that review I talked about. But the councils, some places, the citizens' assembly actually make the decision, and some of them they make a recommendation. But either way, it needs to be brought in. That's me talked out, is it?
I think that's us, 6 o'clock. So yeah, thank you both, Jan and Lindsay. That was great.
Thanks very much.